The dense underbrush of the wildlife sanctuary felt like a maze, a labyrinth of twisted roots, thick vines, and towering trees that reached toward the sky like ancient sentinels. Light barely touched the forest floor, casting everything in a muted green glow. It was a world where time seemed to slow, where every step felt deliberate and every sound amplified. A place so wild and untouched by man that it had the feel of something primordial, something ancient. For months, Henry had been monitoring the sanctuary, documenting the movements of the wildlife that called it home. He was a conservationist, driven by an unyielding passion for the creatures that lived in the hidden corners of the world. His job was not only to track these animals, but also to protect them from the creeping dangers of the outside world, illegal poaching, habitat destruction, and even the slow encroachment of human settlements. But the work had grown harder in recent years. The forest felt different, more tense, more unpredictable. Tonight, as dusk settled, Henry was tracking a family of gray foxes. They had been moving stealthily through the undergrowth, often eluding him for days, their presence only revealed by the occasional paw print or flicker of movement through the shadows. They were elusive creatures, known for their cunning and ability to adapt to the ever-changing world of the forest. But Henry had been patient, and he had learned their habits, their patterns. He had even become familiar with the rustling of leaves and the subtle shifts in the wind that signaled their passing. The evening air had a dampness to it, and the forest seemed to hum with life, though nothing was visible. It was the sort of place where a single sound could betray a presence. The snap of a twig, the distant hoot of an owl, or the rustling of a leaf could betray the tiniest movement in the undergrowth, and Henry was aware of it all. Every sound, every shift. The air was thick with the smell of earth and pine, the sharp tang of wild herbs, but tonight, something felt off. As he crouched by the edge of the forest clearing, his eyes scanning the dimly lit foliage, he caught sight of a flicker of movement, too fast to be a deer, too low to be a bird. The shadows shifted again, and there, just beyond the reach of the trees, a gray tail darted past. The fox was quick, almost invisible, its fur a perfect match for the surroundings. Henry stilled himself, holding his breath. The fox didn't stop, moving with a purpose, its sleek body weaving through the trees. There was something about its movements that seemed different tonight. It was more deliberate than usual, as if it had a destination in mind. But Henry knew better than to chase after it immediately. Foxes, especially the gray ones, were known for their evasive nature. If he moved too soon, he would lose it. He waited and waited. Time stretched as the fox moved deeper into the woods. The sun had completely dipped below the horizon now, and the moon was a thin crescent, casting little light. The world felt more oppressive, the forest darker, as if holding its breath. Finally, the fox paused in a small clearing surrounded by thick underbrush. Henry took a step forward, but as he did, the forest seemed to shift. A low growl rumbled from somewhere nearby, an unexpected sound that made Henry freeze. His heart skipped a beat. For a moment, everything went still. Then another growl, this one closer, followed by a thud of something heavy moving through the woods. His eyes widened as the rustling intensified, and Henry's mind raced. The forest had always been full of predators, but something was different tonight. This wasn't just the typical threat from a lone coyote or bobcat. This was something much larger. He strained his ears, trying to pick out the sound amidst the growing chaos of rustling leaves. Suddenly, the gray fox dashed forward, its tail flicking just out of sight. Without thinking, Henry followed, moving as quietly as possible through the forest, trying to avoid the creeping tension that seemed to hang in the air. The deeper he ventured, the stronger the sense of danger grew. The trees towered above him like silent giants, blocking what little moonlight there was. The air grew colder, damp, and then the unmistakable sound of snapping branches echoed through the forest. Henry stopped, his breath caught in his throat. He wasn't alone. From the corner of his eye, a shape appeared, massive, hulking, and moving with a terrifying speed. It was a wild boar, its tusks gleaming in the moonlight as it charged through the underbrush, anger and fear radiating off of it. It was the sort of boar that men spoke of in hushed tones, an apex predator in its own right. But what made this one even more dangerous was that it was cornered. And when a cornered animal fought, it fought with everything it had. Henry's instincts kicked in, and he moved quickly, ducking behind a tree. His mind raced, calculating the next step. But there was something more pressing than the boar now. The gray fox was still moving, but it was moving with purpose. The fox had turned its head, its eyes locking onto Henry's for just a split second. But it didn't stop. It didn't hesitate. It kept moving, leading him further into the forest, deeper into the unknown. The Tianzian thickened. Suddenly everything went still. The boar had vanished. The fox had stopped. Henry's heart raced as the forest seemed to hold its breath. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing moved. Then, in the distance, there came a sound. Faint, almost inaudible at first. It was a whisper of a growl. Henry's eyes widened. He wasn't sure what it was, but it wasn't the boar, and it wasn't any animal he had encountered before. It sounded different. It sounded wrong. The gray fox moved again, but this time it wasn't alone. Another fox emerged from the shadows, its movements smooth and deliberate, its gaze sharp. They circled together, silent, watching the space around them. The atmosphere felt dense, as if the forest had become a pressure chamber, and the danger wasn't in the creatures he knew. It was in the ones hiding, just beyond his reach. Henry stepped forward, barely making a sound, his heart pounding in his chest. The fox's eyes never left him as they moved silently, pulling him deeper into the woods. And then it happened. A shadow shifted in the corner of his eye, too fast to follow. There, hidden behind the thick trunks of trees, a third fox appeared. This one wasn't like the others. Its fur was darker, more disheveled, its eyes glowing a fierce yellow. It was watching him, waiting. For the first time, Henry realized something that sent a chill down his spine. These weren't just any foxes. They were part of something much larger. A pack. A force of nature working in unison, leading him somewhere he wasn't sure he should go. And then, like a breath of wind, the tension snapped. The last fox lunged toward him, and in that instant the full force of the pack's design became clear. They were not simply leading him into the woods. They were guiding him to something. Something that had been waiting for him. With no time to process, the forest seemed to swallow him whole. The foxes were gone, and Henry was left alone, standing in the silence, surrounded by the endless, empty night. The forest, for once, had claimed its mystery. Henry stood frozen, the weight of silence pressing down on him, the dense canopy of trees now forming an almost impenetrable ceiling above him. His heart raced, but his instincts told him to move. He had been led here for a reason. He didn't know why, but the sense of urgency that filled him now couldn't be ignored. With a deep breath, he steadied himself, the cool night air rushing through his lungs. His boots crunched against the thick layers of leaves as he took a cautious step forward, scanning the ground for any sign of movement. The path ahead was unclear, but his senses were heightened now. Every shift in the breeze, every flicker of movement in the distance, sharp in his awareness. The eerie feeling that had crept into the forest earlier hadn't dissipated. It had only intensified. As he moved deeper, the darkness thickened, swallowing up the moonlight that had been his only guide. The scent of earth and rotting wood grew stronger, mingling with something far more acrid, almost metallic. A scent that made Henry's skin prickle. He paused, straining his ears. At first he thought it was just the wind, but then he heard it again, A low, guttural growl. This time it was closer, unmistakable. The forest wasn't as silent as it had seemed. Something was moving in the shadows, something large and unpredictable. The gray foxes had been leading him somewhere, but now it felt like they were nowhere to be found. They had vanished, disappeared into the very air, and Henry was left alone to face whatever lay ahead. The air felt thick, dense with something ancient, something primal. Another growl, closer now. Henry's heart raced faster. The growl wasn't from a boar or any other familiar predator. It was deeper, more resonant, more like a sound from the earth itself, something that rumbled beneath the surface. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet remained rooted. He could hear the foxes again, somewhere in the distance, moving quickly, their silhouettes darting through the trees. Were they leading him into danger? Or had they been trying to protect him? Then, through the thick underbrush, he saw something. A flash of movement. At first, he thought it was a shadow, a trick of the light, but no, it was too deliberate, too real. It was a figure, a large, dark figure, gliding effortlessly through the trees. His breath caught in his throat as the figure grew clearer. A large wolf, its fur dark as the night sky, its eyes gleaming with an unsettling intelligence. It wasn't like any wolf he had seen before, not in the wild or even in the research he had done. This one was different, bigger. Its eyes were like pools of liquid amber, glowing with an unnatural awareness. It stood there, watching him, its body perfectly still. Then, without warning, the wolf moved. It was a blur of motion, faster than Henry's eyes could follow. He took a step back, his hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight at his waist. But before he could pull it out, the wolf was gone. The forest felt emptier now, the eerie growl fading into the distance. But it wasn't gone completely. The sense of being hunted, of something lurking in the shadows, remained. He turned around, ready to head back toward the sanctuary's perimeter, but the path he had come from was no longer clear. The forest had shifted. The trees, which had seemed to form a natural path just moments ago, now looked like an impenetrable wall of green. He tried again, pushing forward, but it was like walking through a maze that was constantly changing. The underbrush thickening, the trees crowding closer together. The forest wasn't simply wild anymore. It was alive, in a way Henry had never felt before. And something had been disturbed. Something ancient. A high-pitched whistle sliced through the air, and Henry spun around. For a split second he thought it was a bird, but it was too sharp, too deliberate. It was the sound of something calling. No, something commanding. The foxes. They had come back. But now they were no longer darting between the trees as before. No, they were standing in front of him. All of them. Dozens of them, their gray coats blending perfectly with the underbrush, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They circled him silently, an unspoken command in the air. And then, in a way that made Henry's blood run cold, they stopped. Their eyes locked onto him, as if they were assessing something. It was as if they were waiting for him to make a choice. Then, something far more dangerous than the foxes stepped into view. The wolf. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its gaze intense and unwavering. For a moment, it simply watched, sizing up Henry as the foxes continued to circle him, an unbroken ring of silent watchers. The air grew thick with tension, a presence too vast to ignore, too overwhelming to dismiss. Henry's pulse quickened, a cold sweat breaking across his forehead. He wasn't just lost in the forest. He was in the midst of something far larger, something older, something he could barely comprehend. He had stumbled upon a hidden part of the sanctuary, a secret known only to the creatures that lived here. The foxes, the wolf, the shifting of the forest, it was all connected. and it was all leading him toward something. With a shudder, Henry understood. The wolf wasn't just any predator. It was the leader, the guardian of this place. And the gray foxes weren't simply trying to avoid danger. They were guiding him to face it. In that moment, the realization struck him with full force. The animals weren't just surviving, they were protecting something precious that had remained hidden in the sanctuary for eons. And now, Henry was at the heart of it. The wolf stepped forward, its presence commanding, the foxes parting to allow it passage. Slowly, Henry took a step back. The ground beneath him shifted as though the forest was moving with him. The path he had thought he knew had evaporated, and the only direction left was forward, into the unknown. Without thinking, Henry took another step, and the forest, like an ancient being awakening, swallowed him whole. As Henry stepped deeper into the shadowed clearing, the air grew colder, heavier, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. The wolf's amber eyes never left him, and the circle of foxes parted to allow him to move forward, as if guiding him into an unseen realm. The forest was silent now, save for the rustling of leaves beneath his feet and the soft, almost imperceptible movement of the foxes around him. With Iak's step, the sense of dread intensified, but so did his curiosity. His mind raced, trying to piece together what he was witnessing. The forest had become a place of power, a realm untouched by time. He couldn't see the path clearly anymore. But it didn't matter. The wolf and the foxes were his guides, and they were leading him somewhere. Suddenly, the wolf stopped, its body perfectly still, its gaze unwavering. The foxes did the same, pausing at the edges of the clearing, forming a silent, motionless boundary. The air was thick with tension, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Henry's pulse quickened. His instincts told him that whatever was about to happen, he was too deep now to turn back. He had come this far, and something primal within him told him to trust the creatures around him, to trust the forest itself. Then, without warning, the ground beneath him shifted again. The trees, once solid and rooted in place, began to move. Slowly at first, and then faster, as if the entire forest was breathing, expanding and contracting like the chest of a sleeping giant. Henry's breath caught in his throat as the trunks of the trees began to twist and bend, their roots pulling from the earth, as if the land itself was awakening after a long slumber. The wolf stepped forward, its presence commanding as always, but now its movements seemed deliberate, purposeful. It circled Henry, its amber eyes glowing brighter, almost as though it were assessing his very soul. The foxes, too, moved synchrony, their movements fluid and seamless, their eyes never leaving Henry as they darted between the shifting trees. Then it happened. A low, rumbling growl emanated from deep within the forest, a sound unlike anything Henry had ever heard. It was not from the wolf. It was something far older, far deeper. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and the air seemed to thicken, as if the forest was coming alive around him, responding to some unseen force. Out of the corner of his eye, Henry saw something moving, something large, massive. It was a shadow, a silhouette at first, but it grew clearer as it moved toward him. His heart pounded in his chest, a primal fear surging through him. It was not a wolf, it was not a bear, it was something else entirely. Something ancient and unknown, hidden in the very fabric of the forest. The wolf stepped in front of him, its body rigid, a low growl vibrating in its chest. The foxes, too, seemed to take a defensive stance, their fur standing on end, their eyes locked on the approaching figure. The forest fell silent again, the tension palpable, as if the creatures of the wild were preparing for something monumental. The shadow grew closer, and Henry could feel the weight of it, a presence that seemed to fill the very air, and then, as it emerged from the shadows of the trees, he saw it. It was a massive creature, unlike anything he had ever encountered. Its body was long and lithe, covered in thick, matted fur that shimmered in the dim light. Its eyes were glowing, a deep, unsettling red, and its movements were fluid and deliberate. It was a creature of the forest, but it was not of this time. It was ancient, a remnant of a long-forgotten era, and it carried with it the weight of 1,000 years of history. Henry stood frozen, his breath shallow, his mind racing to comprehend what he was seeing. The creature did not approach him. Instead, it circled around the wolf, its movements deliberate, as if sizing up its opponent. The wolf growled again, more forcefully this time, and the foxes seemed to tighten their formation around Henry, as if protecting him from the creature.